What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This is episode number 288. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line, just like every week, it's Luis Scott-Vargas. Luis, what's up, buddy?
Not a whole lot. I managed to transfer my sickness onto you somehow.
Yeah, you did.
I feel fine now, and you sound like, garbage. So.
Yes, I feel similarly. I picked up a cold. It's not terrible. I'm okay, but I definitely don't, I'm stuffed up and all that, so you guys will have to bear with me.
Trust me, I was there for like a full week, so I'm just glad I'm not.
Yeah, and you somehow sent this over the internet, by the way, when we recorded
Marshall
the show.
and I haven't been in the same state for over a week, so this has nothing to do with me, actually.
Yeah. So first things first, Limited Resources is brought to you each and every week by channelfireball.com. And, in the aftermath of GP Vegas, it's time to look forward to any other events that they might be running. In this case, there's one in Europe. It's GP Copenhagen coming up. You can find details for that GP at gpcopenhagen.com. And, you should probably get registered if you're going to be playing in that. There wasn't 10,000 seats at least available, right?
No, currently we have 636 seats remaining. I think we would very heavily advise you to pre-register. We don't want anyone to miss out if they want to play in the Grand Prix. Though, much like every Grand Prix that Channel Fireball runs, there's a lot going on even if you don't play in the Grand Prix. There are a lot of people came to Vegas to just hang out, play side events, buy, sell, and trade, and you can do a lot of that at the Grand Prix as well. So I would, if you like Magic, I would advise you to go to the Grand Prix. For
sure. There's going to be some pros there, right?
There are. We've got William Jensen's coming over from Las Vegas all the way down to Copenhagen, or over to Copenhagen. And then we also have Frank Karsten and Martin Yuza, two CFB pros from Europe who are going to be there. And I believe they're going to be putting on some kind of seminar on Friday. I will check that. But other than that, there's just gunslinging. There's a lot of just hanging out, and there's a lot going on at Copenhagen. Plus, we give people a ton of stuff just for signing up. We give you a bag, sleeves, a playmat with Kiki Jiki actually is the playmat image of choice, and a bunch of CFB tokens, and potentially even a CFB water bottle, which I actually use all the time. I have to.
Nice. Also, of course, check out channelfireball.com for a whole bunch of awesome free content, videos, articles, podcasts, all that kind of stuff for free over there. And of course, a full selection of singles, sealed product, and supplies. You can also support the show directly through the Patreon. Thank you so much for those of you that have taken the time to do that. You can choose however much you want to give. It can be 50 cents. It can be $1. You can go up from there. And you get cool little perks as well. I've been working on getting the next batch of thank you notes sent out. And so those should be going out next week. So if you've been waiting for a while for those, hang tight, almost out the door. And of course, as part of the Patreon, you also get a chance to ask questions, and I'll put up a post about once a month to gather questions for this segment on the show. And this one comes from listener Christopher McKnight, who says, besides obvious sideboard cards like Naturalize, how do you decide what cards are best left in the sideboard? And when do you bring those in? He says, I have a hard time sideboarding a lot of the time and usually just give up and hit submit deck, which I have to say,
awesome way to close.
I appreciate his honesty in that he's just like, look, this is what I end up doing, because I think that's just being honest, right? I think a lot of people do that kind of thing, and maybe they don't want to admit it, that they just whatever, I'm just going to hit submit. But I think a lot of people do that. So Luis, to address the question, how do you decide which cards are best left in the board?
When you're looking at, cards like Naturalize, which kills an artifact or an enchantment, besides that, I like siding in Shatter, which kills artifacts, or Erase, which kills enchantments. These are all... Now, the non-obvious sideboarding is, it's non-obvious. It's not... There's not a hard and fast rule I can give you, but here are some of the things I look for when I'm sideboarding. If I have some 1 damage effects, often you're not going to want to play too many of those, cards that deal 1 damage, or cards like Shrivel from the last, from Modern Masters gives all creatures -1/-1. When your opponent plays a bunch of 2/1s, then you want to put those cards in. Another somewhat non-obvious thing is if your opponent has a bunch of cheap early creatures, even putting in 1 mana 1/1 is not a great creature. And in fact, we even told you not to play it in our Traps episode. But 1 mana 1/1 flyer is great against an opponent that has multiple 1 toughness flyers of their own. If they have 2/1 flyers and 3/1 flyers, I will board in 1/1 flyer all the time.
Yeah, another card that pops up along that same line are cards that are like 2 mana for a 1/3, right? Maybe some slide ability, maybe not, gains you some life or does something minimal, where those usually aren't quite high enough impact to get a slot in the main deck. But, if you find yourself running up against a deck that's playing a bunch of 2/1s and small creatures, maybe tokens, stuff like that, those type of cards can go up in value and they can replace something that costs 5 or 6 mana that's just too slow in that type of matchup. But those are a lot of the non-obvious changes, are changing the way that your deck plays out, not necessarily those silver bullet type cards. And, from what I found is a lot of that depends on, like, I'm not going to say how well you drafted, but more like how well the draft went. Sometimes if you're using picks to change colors and kind of, find your lane, you don't have that much flexibility post board. But other times when you were kind of one of the only people in your color and you end up with a bunch of these, cards that you would consider playable, but just didn't end up making the main deck in this particular choice. Those are the ones that you can often look at as not obvious sideboard cards.
Another place to gain advantage is to side out cards based on the removal you see from your opponent. If you see a lot of, deal 2 or deal 1 effects, then sometimes you can actually board out your bad low toughness creatures for, like you said, 1/3s. Like, I'd rather have 2/1 or 1/3s in my deck than 2/1s if my opponent has multiple cards that deal 1 damage.
Yeah, that's a good point too, yeah.
Another card that's pretty obvious for you to bring in is Plummet, because if your opponent has flyers, you bring in Plummet. But on the reverse of that, if you can counter sideboard. If you see that your opponent has Plummet and you only have, say, 2 flyers in your deck, they're both 3/3 flyers, they're not 5/5, lifelink bombs. Take out those 2 3/3s and hopefully strand your opponent with a Plummet in hand. That sort of thing does give you a pretty big advantage.
Yeah. All right, good stuff. Let's move on now to the Crack-A-Pack. I've got a Modern Masters 2015 pack sitting here.
And at the end, I get all the rares. Is that correct?
That is not how that works, no. And next week on the show, we're going to be doing our monthly Patreon giveaway as well, which will, of course, include the rares from all the Crack-A-Packs from the last giveaway. And no, you're not eligible, Luis, to get it. All right, let's see what we got here. Oh, we can start off with a good one here. We've got a Blinding Soul Eater. So that's the tapper, right? The Phyrexian Mana tapper. I like this card a lot.
Yeah, Blinding Soul Eater is one of the cards I like starting with the most because it just transitions nicely into a lot of different decks you can draft.
Yeah, and being colorless is a pretty big deal in this set too, where there's a lot of emphasis in finding your slot at the table and what your seat really wants to be drafting. Blood Ogre is next. That's the 2 and a red 2/2 first strike with Bloodthirst 1. And I've been moderately pleased with this card in the format. It doesn't really feel like the full on Bloodthirst deck is there. There's just not quite enough of it running around. But this guy just seems fine to me. Like 2/2 first strike for 3 is meh. But if you can get it up to 3/3, then it's pretty good.
I don't mind Blood Ogre. I'm not really that impressed with it. It feels like slightly lower on the curve than most cards in this format, even if you can reliably Bloodthirst it. So, yes, it has its role, but I'm never excited to play it. I'm certainly not taking it.
Never first picking. Ghostly Changeling, another card we're just not first picking here.
Certainly not.
Thoughtcast, fairly mediocre as well.
I don't even like Thoughtcast in a lot of the affinity decks I draft, so I'm going to say that Thoughtcast is definitely not where I want to start.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it says affinity for artifacts, so to the naked eye it might seem like, oh well, it's a card draw spell, it's got affinity, that's something I could use, but the reality is that the cards that pull you into affinity they are actual artifacts, not the ones that reward you for having them. Sunspear Shikari is next. That's the 2/2 for 1 and a white, and if it gets equipped, it's got first strike and lifelink. Cards impressed me. If you would ask me when the set came out if Blood Ogre or Sunspear Shikari would be better, I would probably tell you Blood Ogre, but now I like Sunspear Shikari better.
Definitely. I agree that this card has overperformed for me. It's one of the cards that I think makes the red-white equipment deck more appealing than I initially thought it was going to be. And it is, the reason that I like this card so much is that you often, the first turn you equip it, get a hit in. And even if it dies after that, you trade it 1 for 1 and you usually get a couple life, 2 to 5 life or 3 to 5 life out of the deal. So in general, I think the card actually pulls its weight, especially since it's 2 mana 2/2, which is not the end of the world.
Yeah, that life gain ends up being pretty important in the type of deck that this goes in as well, because if your opponent tries to race you, then Sunspear Shikari makes that quite difficult. But also, all this equipping is a big tempo hit, right? You got to spend a whole turn, slapping a bunch of equipment on one of your creatures or whatever. And, if you can gain 4 or 5 life, that sometimes can buy you, the time you need to get another thing up and running. Vampire Lacerators next. Meh.
even though this is a key card in the Bloodthirst aggro deck or the black-based aggro decks, I still don't like it. I've yet to cast one in this format, and I'm pretty happy about that.
Yeah,
I don't think that record's going to change.
Yeah, when my opponent casts it, I usually feel more relief than anything, and that's not good. When that's the pretty good one drop. Vines of Vastwood. Poor Vines of Vastwood. This is a card that I've just had a really hard time finding a slot for in any of my decks.
Same.
Yeah, my green decks just don't want combat tricks, period. And the ones that I've been running, and I just don't really know where this is supposed to go. It's not that it's a bad card. It's one of the better tricks they've made, but it's just like this is a high level format. You don't have room for stuff like that, or like this next one either. Goblin Warpaint.
The only reason this is in the set is so you can play a Daybreak Coronet on one of your creatures.
That's why it's here.
I mean, I don't really know other than that. This is not an equipment, so it doesn't even help like cards like Shikari specifically, but even past it on the other double strikers, it's just not a very exciting card.
No.
This is a card I didn't like in most normal formats, and the power level of this format is at least a notch or two above normal.
Yeah, for sure. And the removal's very good too. It's not like it's one of those formats where the removal all costs 5 or 6 mana and you can sort of sneak in a Goblin Warpaint for, huge hit of damage a few times. Like you get the thing snapped off pretty routinely by a bunch of the different removal spells. Sign in Blood is next. Interestingly, this is another one of those cards that I've just had a hard time finding a room for.
I was going to say the exact same thing. It's a powerful card, and if you can cast it, with 10 or 11 swamps in your deck, yeah, you love to play the card, but it's just not a card that fits into most decks I draft. I just don't know. I don't know what deck. I mean, I guess the Spirits deck or the Black-Green Sacrifice deck wants it a little more than the Bloodthirst deck, but still, that mana base is just not one I end up with.
Yeah, same. All right, here's one. Rusted Relic. Old Rusty. 4 mana artifact, and if you've got Metalcraft, it becomes a 5/5. This is this is one way you can capitalize on being the affinity deck, though. Again, I'm not sure this is I'd rather have a Blinding Soul Eater to start off with, for example, than a Rusted Relic.
Definitely. Blinding Soul Eater, I think, is slightly higher power level and is just not nearly as deck specific. As you said when we went over the different Modern Masters archetypes that we liked, I don't want to first pick an affinity card. That's not how you end up in affinity. At least that's not how I want to end up in affinity.
Right. All right. Well, we found the blue Sign in Blood. It's Tezzeret's Gambit.
This card I like a lot more than Sign in Blood.
I do too. Yeah. It's 3 and a Phyrexian blue, and you draw. It's a sorcery. Draw 2 cards, and then proliferate. The proliferate can be interesting, though. I have found it's not super easy to leverage that. It's like the times when it pops up, I'm pleasantly surprised rather than expecting it. But Tezzeret's Gambit, I have actually played in multiple decks, and I found it fine.
It doesn't need a proliferate strategy, or you don't need to be drafting a proliferate strategy for this card to be good. It's just a colorless divination, which actually is more powerful than it sounds, and I already kind of love divination. It just has a lot of... I
have to sell you on that, did
right.
I?
It's got a lot of little synergies going on with the different counters and whatnot, but even past that, it just gets you out of mana screw and helps when you're mana flooded. It just does a lot of different things reasonably well.
Yeah. My favorite is casting it after Lore Scale Coatl. That's sweet. Okay, now we're in business, Luis. We have a reason to go into a specific archetype. In this case, interestingly, it's fighting with, I think, the only card that I've really considered first picking, which is Blinding Soul Eater out of this pack. It's Cranial Plating. So,
now this one I like.
Yeah, this is you and I both shot down Thoughtcast and Rusted Relic as I don't really want to move into the artifact deck without having a reason for it. Well, we just found our reason: plating.
And one of the cool things about plating is that it actually isn't as linear as you might think. It does not lock you into drafting affinity. This is a very good card in the red-white equipment deck. Yeah, totally.
I think this card's really sweet. I mean, it's been broken for a long time, and it turns out it still is. I wasn't sure that was going to be the case, but it does enough. It just does enough work to be great. I actually did a draft online earlier today, and I cast a couple of spells in one turn. I had a whole bunch of mana. My opponent did as well, and I had a Sylvan Bounty in my hand that I didn't need to cycle, so I was going to gain a bunch of life at some point when my opponent, maybe made some big move. And as it turns out, the big move was play Cranial Plating, which activated the Glass Dusk Hulk, equip it, and hit me for 13 and killed me. I was like, well, I guess I waited a little too long on this thing. It turns out Cranial Plating can do tons of damage in one hit sometimes.
It's the kind of reward I like. I think I would first pick a Cranial Plating over a Blinding Soul Eater.
Ooh, that's interesting. last uncommon is Shrewd Hatchling. So this one's kind of weird, but it's the 3 and a blue or red, so it's 4 mana, and it's a 6/6, but it enters the battlefield with 4 -1/-1 counters. And whenever you cast a blue spell, you remove a counter from it, and whenever you cast a red spell, you remove a counter from it. So it starts at 2/2 and just sort of grows up to 6/6 fairly quickly, usually. And you can also pay a blue or a red to have a creature not be able to block it this turn. It's not can't block, but it can't block this thing.
It's a very bizarre card. I do like the card. It's fit fairly well in a different blue-red decks I've drafted, but it's not the kind of card I think has the power level to be a first pick, and it's really good in specifically blue and red decks. It's less good in decks that are just one of those two colors, so I wouldn't start with this. I think it's a worse card to start with than Soul Eater or Cranial Plating.
Yeah, I'm with you. Our foil is Death Denied. Interestingly, another card that I've had a hard time fitting into my builds, though it's not a bad card, it's black, X for an instant. It's an arcane spell, and it says return X target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. But, for me, it's like this spell isn't particularly efficient, and it has a pretty high setup cost. You need relevant creatures in the graveyard. Assuming that you're drafting a good deck, most of your cards will probably be relevant. Most of your creatures, I should say. But it's slow. I mean, you need to take basically a turn off to get this thing going. I don't know. There's definitely attrition matchups that I could see bringing in Death Denied, but I have yet to start one in my main.
Yeah, there's no denying it's powerful, but it is slow enough that I generally tend not to main deck it either.
All right, our rare. Oh, this is a weird one. It's a Sunforger. I've never actually played with this card. I haven't gotten one in any of my drafts yet, and I had to read it the first time somebody played it against me because I just hadn't seen it. It's a weird one. So it's 3 colorless for an equipment that has an equip cost of 3 as well. And the equipped creature actually gets pretty huge. It's +4/+0. So it can turn effectively any creature that can attack into a huge threat. And then this is the weird part. You can pay red, white, and unattach it. That's the cost. So you take it off of your creature. If you do that, you get to search your library for a red or white instant card with converted mana cost 4 or less and cast that card without paying its mana cost, and then you shuffle. What a weird card, huh?
It is a weird card. It is a card that has seen play in a Pro Tour top 8 and Constructed, though.
Really?
Block Constructed. Ravnica Block Constructed. Sunforger was used to search up a bunch of lightning helixes.
Oh, crazy.
Helices. Yeah.
Now, how good do you consider it in Modern Masters 2015?
It's a playable card if you're red and white and have cards to get with it. It is not a card that's powerful enough for me to first pick and try to go into that. I don't think you want to take a 2-color card with a kind of dubious payoff. Like, it is good if you get it going, but it's not good enough to go into red-white from pick 1.
Right. And that's really the key, right? Is making sure that you're discerning when you evaluate the card and recognize that even though it has a colorless mana up in the upper right-hand corner, it is in fact a red and white card. I mean, not that you couldn't play it. You could play, I think if you're in the double strike deck, which happens to be red white anyway, but you could.
That's the funny thing is that the deck that would play this as a colorless card is already red white.
It's already red white anyway. Yeah. So you mentioned, let's go back then. If we're not taking Sunforger, it's Cranial Plating or Blinding Soul Eater is what we both have it narrowed down to. And I kind of got the vibe that you were going to go with Plating. Is that where you ended up?
Yeah, I did say that, and I do think that I would take the Plating. I believe Soul Eater is a slightly stronger first pick, but I like drafting Cranial Plating decks. I will admit this is more of a I want to draft a sweet deck than it is a correct pick. If you sat me down back at Grand Prix Vegas and, I was drafting on day 2, I would take the Soul Eater. So I think the Soul Eater is the correct pick.
Okay.
I've drafted the format enough now that I'd rather take the Plating and try to shoot for the moon and get a sweet deck. Okay. So I'm fully admitting that, though. You have to realize that, like, I think the 2 cards are close. I think Soul Eater edges it out just because it goes into more different decks. And as such, I would recommend taking Blinding Soul Eater first, but I think it's close enough that I'm willing to sacrifice a little bit of that equity just to end up with a really cool affinity deck or a red-white equipment deck, so I'd rather just take the Plating.
Yeah, that's fair. That happens pretty often, I think, to most people that play a lot of drafts is, you're like, okay, I know what the right pick is, but I'll take the higher upside pick with Plating. For me, I would take the Blinding Soul Eater. I guess I'm just not there yet. I actually enjoy that card quite a bit too, so I feel nice and open if I take the Soul Eater.
The most dangerous part of any draft format for my Magic Online account is after I've gotten bored with all the normal decks and try to draft the sweet ones.
When you enter the ticket burning stage of the format. Oh man, I'm similar though. It took me a while, a lot of formats before I found that level, but then once I did, I tend to hit it every time now. Okay, let's move on to the main topic, Luis. We've got a pretty meaty one here ahead of us. This is going to be interesting. So this is how to make in-game decisions, right? And, Luis, if you had just, sent me a text or something and said, hey, let's do a show about how to make in-game decisions, I may have called you crazy. I may have just said, that is just too broad. It's too personal, right? It's like everybody has different approaches and different things. But then you made this nice big outline in our show notes, and I read through it and I'm just like, this just seems really good. The way though that I think I want to do this is to kind of get an idea for how you approach these things. I don't think that it would be prudent for us to say this is how you do this, right? Like there's just going to be too many differences in approach for different people, but I like the idea of saying, okay, well, we've got a world-class player on the podcast. Let's ask him how he does it. And then as a viewer, as a listener, then I can take that information and I can apply it to how I do it. And I can say, you know what? I don't do that. I'm going to start doing that. Or I can say, oh, I do that too, but I do it in a different way. And now that I see how Luis does it, that might suit me better. Or, I've got that base covered or whatever. And, of course, I'll be throwing in, my 2 cents here and there as well. But, given that I have a cold and given that you're the one that wrote out this whole thing, I feel like it would be pretty sweet to sort of walk through this and let me kind of guide the ship, that you're ultimately, in charge of here. So where should we start?
Yeah, it is funny that I did write more than some articles I've written.
Yeah, you went off on this thing. I thought it was fantastic. Though you're like, I put some notes in the show. I'm like, okay, I'll check that out. I'm like, whoa, there's a whole article here.
And as such, where we should start is actually recommending a whole nother episode. I think that's actually the best play to be fully prepared here. And a lot of the people listening now will have listened to that episode, as they are diligent listeners of the podcast. But episode 273, 15 episodes ago, we did a episode called Having a Plan. And so much of what I talk about now is going to sound similar, or at least a lot of it is going to sound similar. And I'm going to go over it. And I think I expanded a lot here, but at the base level, you should always have a plan. You should not be taking actions that you don't know why you're taking those actions.
Yeah, and I think that is good. That's sort of the recommended reading portion,
right?
Yeah, but this does take a different tack on it for sure. And I think that if you've listened to that episode, you're going to get a lot out of this one as well. So,
oh, definitely, this goes way above and beyond. This is way more specific. Like, the way I approached this is I just sat down and thought like, what do I do when I make a decision, and how do I approach each turn of Magic? And one of the things that's really helped me look at that is actually the what I titled the episode in our notes is the What's the Play episode, because that's here's the plug, the series that I've been writing on Channel Fireball, where I just look over plays. Mm-hmm. And it's actually been really useful to see how I approach every play, and because I have to try to explain like, why do I make these plays? I would actually recommend looking at those too, because I try to just go step by step. How do I come to a decision in a specific game?
Which can be really hard to do, especially for somebody like you, because I know that, you tend to be a very intuitive player. You've got, thousands of hours of Magic under your belt, plus your brain just works in that certain way. Where I've seen you do like 3 complicated things at once. I've seen you break down board states at like a snap instant. You have sort of a, where I know you're not like going, okay, well, he's got 5 power and she's got 3 power. So if they block, you just don't do that in your head, right? Not on a routine basis when you're playing. So it must have been challenging for you to sit down and sort of break down what's actually happening behind the scenes.
To some degree, but and I think that one of the advantages of internalizing a lot of this will come with time. Like I think a very interesting question I got asked on Twitter was, when you actually do run into the scenarios like what's the play in a real tournament, do you actually think about all the things you talk about? And the answer is mostly yes, sometimes no. Some of them are so complicated that I don't get to actually go through every single permutation. Mm-hmm. But most of it's because I don't actually look at all this. So I'm going to talk more about that as I go through the turn here. But I think that this outline is what I'm doing, even if I'm kind of in real life, in real practice, skipping some of the steps, as I will mention, because I don't have to do them consciously anymore. But, when you start, you certainly should be thinking about that. And I know some players who kind of do derive everything from scratch every turn. And they don't have like an intuitive gameplay flow in quite the same manner. There's nothing wrong with that. And I think that is one of those things you mentioned that are kind of individual focused.
Yeah,
so
it's funny because I can speak to it for myself, where I remember when I first started playing that I did not have any of it, right? I was just ground upping it and sort of going over those things. But now it was interesting reading the notes and your process. And of course, we're going to start on that in just a second here. But from my perspective, because there are many of the things that I do intuitively that you do as well. But then there were things that I know you do intuitively that I can't or I don't yet, right? And I just don't have the reps or my brain doesn't work that way or whatever. But it is, I think, very pertinent to note that each person is going to handle each of these things in a different way. But, and this is a huge one, you can have that intuitive grasp on what happens in the game. And of course, what we're talking about here is that, Luis, if he's going to play around something, he doesn't have to pull up a list of all the available cards that could possibly exist. And he knows that his opponent could have it. And he has this intuition that he's developed after years of repetition. And that's actually what usually gets you that repetition. It's not like, you just start off playing and you're just like, I'm intuitive. I just know these things. It just doesn't work that way. The way it works is your brain learns sort of slowly in the background as you do repetitions of things. I remember when I was first learning to play poker, that's how it was for me too, where, poker has a lot of complex math that has to happen before you know sort of what type of play you should be making. And what I would have to do is write down the details of what I did at the table, go with a friend or on the computer afterwards, work through all those details to see what I considered correctly and what I didn't. And of course, how it ended up. And then after doing that over and over again, you start to see patterns and you start to see the same things pop up. And then your brain just knows sort of from almost muscle memory, like, oh, I've seen this scenario before. I know what the parameters are. Now I can adjust my knobs and buttons here and then and go with the play that I decide. And, Luis, you happen to be very far down the path when it comes to this for Magic, but everybody's going to be at a different stage of it. Like I said, I noticed some where I wasn't, quite where you are here. And I'm sure some of our listeners are going to say, well, I'm still on this level or whatever. But this, I think, is a good goal, right? This is a good way to, I think if you use Luis's approach here, it should be good. So when we start, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say one last thing about intuition. Actually, the book Blink by Malcolm Gladwell played a pretty important part in my development of Magic. Even though, not everything he writes is as firmly scientific as you might wish, a lot of what I read in that book really did speak to me. And the main takeaway for me was that your subconscious is very, very powerful. It has a lot of brain power that you don't have access to consciously. And the more you can offload onto that, the more you can process all the available decision trees. And that sounds like a really big thing and a tough thing to do. But like almost anything, if you want to be good at really, really good at a lot of different things, whether it's just Magic or otherwise, I think the more you do it to get to your subconscious to the point where it actually knows what to do and can give you a lot of interesting clues, I think that really helps. So we've got a lot more specifics. Don't worry. This all sounds very vague and theoretical.
Yeah, but I like setting the stage on this level. I mean, I read
definitely.
That book after you recommended it to me, and I had similar reaction to it too. So
basically, the takeaway again for me was your subconscious knows so much more than you give it credit for because you don't have like direct access to that. And once you can learn to interpret that or get cues from that, then you have just a bit more power at your hands. It can go wrong. I think some of my worst results have been when I'm played too much on intuition when I'm out of practice, because then my subconscious is telling me things are just not good. And that's why I tend to do better in streaks where I practice a lot more. Like basically when I put a lot more time into Magic, I do better. And that's not rocket science by any stretch, but it is one of the weaknesses to how I play. Whereas I think some people, might be less on intuition and more on figuring everything out in any given scenario, which means they don't have to necessarily play that much at any given time to be as good as they need to be. So.
Yeah, and you can see that at the tables too. All right, so let's jump into the first level here, the deck building level. Walk us through what you mean by the deck building level.
And so this is a level that's this is step one, but it's almost step zero, because we're going to talk about how to make decisions in game. And before you even have a game, you have a deck. And in limited, it's going to be a lot more difficult to figure out what your deck's trying to do than in constructed. In The base question you're trying to ask, and again, this goes back to having a plan, is what is your deck trying to do? And in a format like Modern Masters, you have more focused decks than in a normal format. So you will have decks, even in normal formats, where my deck's really control-ish. I've got a great 7-mana bomb and a great 6-mana bomb, and I've got 7 removal spells, and I've got some defensive creatures. That makes your job a lot easier when you know your deck's trying to do that. Or my deck's really aggressive. I've got 2 1-drops, I've got 7 2-drops, and I've got 5 3-drops, and I've got 2 falter effects and a bunch of burn spells. All right, you've got a pretty definitive plan here, too. You're not trying to get to the late game. You're trying to kill your opponent. And when your deck falls into one of those categories, then that makes in-game decisions much, much easier because you know the role you're going to be playing in the vast majority of games. I'm not saying control decks can't beat down. Sometimes you draw your, Jeskai Sage into Morph, into Lotus Path Djinn and attack your opponent to death. But in general, your control decks are trying to control and your beatdown decks are trying to beat down. The problem is, in Limited, I don't know what number exactly, but I would say the vast majority, 70, 80% of decks are just mid-range decks. They're decks that maybe lean towards one direction or another, but they don't have an overarching game plan that's going to be present in every single game.
Right. And that's, and it tends to shift based on your individual draw, right? Like how the game plays out, that kind of stuff. So
once you've built your deck, the answer is you just have to evaluate each game separately. And that is going to be the general answer. And that's what makes this topic so difficult. A lot of your decks, well, you're attacking when you get the draw that lets you attack, and you're controlling when you get the draw that lets you control, also based on what you've seen out of your opponent. You're not going into the game knowing one way or the other. So you've got a deck, and I would say, again, you've got a normal deck that falls into the normal limited parameters, which is you can play the beatdown, you can play the control. It's just going to depend on what cards you draw and what cards your opponent draw. So step 2 is evaluating the board. And here you have to look at all the information you have available. That's your opponent's side of the board, your side of the board. Clearly that's just, information available to both players. And then what's in your hand. And what's in your hand is also going to decide which role you want to take. So an example of this is you're playing a normal mid-range deck, but you're on the play and you had a turn 2 soul summons, turn 3 manifest or face down creature, a megamorph of some kind, and then you have a Flatten in your hand. Here it's kind of plausible, especially if you have let's say an Aven Surveyor in your hand as well.
I like this hand.
Yeah, this hand's great, right? Somehow you're playing 3 colors though. I don't know how that happened. but with this hand, even if you're, a mid-range deck that has a slightly more controlling element, it seems very plausible to kill your opponent's creature, attack for 4. They're already at 18 because you already attacked them for 2. Their first play was a 3-drop. And the next turn play Surveyor and attack them again. And that puts them so far behind that, it seems like you can very easily take the beatdown role in this game.
Yeah, and that's a path that you can envision quite easily.
And again, most games aren't going to be quite this easy. If you don't have the Surveyor in your hand, it gets a lot more difficult. If you have a different 4-drop, like a 4-drop 3/3, then it's not quite as clear. So once you evaluated your hand, is there a strong role you can take? Again, if there is, then you can make decisions slanted towards that role. Aggressive roles want to do things, like I said, like remove their creatures to attack for damage or set up a good attack the next turn. Whereas control decks are trying to mitigate the life total loss. They're not trying to race. Aggro decks will frequently want to race. You'll offer trades more aggressively. Like you'll basically make attacks where even if you're trading down, you're getting extra damage through. Control's going to be the opposite. They're not going to attack with a 2/2 so they can block a 2/1 because they don't want to take damage.
Right. And this comes up fairly often, and it references back to the first stage there, right? The deck building level, right? There are sometimes games where you have a similar draw to what you described. Let's say we take the Aven Surveyor off, but you go 2-drop, 3-drop, Flatten, right? You can play those cards in order. But you actually look at your deck, and since you drafted it and built it, you should have a good idea for what its game plan is going to be. And your opponent plays a reasonable 3-drop, maybe something just mediocre, a 2/3 or something that kind of stifles your attack with your 2-drop and your 3-drop. It can be tempting to just fire that off, kill it, and get in for a bunch of damage because, hey, that's a good way to win a game of Magic. But I think if you think one step back and look at your deck, you'll probably realize that if you're playing a controlling deck, your deck probably doesn't have the punch to actually get the job done to completion here, right? Your opponent is likely to follow up with another creature. It's probably going to be a little bigger than the last one as well. And now you've used your Flatten to get in 3 or 4 damage, which seemed like a good idea at the time. But an aggressive deck, can follow that up with Sprinting Warbrute or some other dash creature, right? They can follow it up with, even just something like a Summit Prowler or something like that, where now they have threats that get to keep on coming out, and getting that blocker out of the way and pushing through for damage keeps, is sort of getting ahead and staying ahead. Where if you look back to your deck and you don't really have the punch to capitalize on that, it's often correct to not use the Flattened just to get in some extra damage. So that's just an example of, trying to marry these two steps together. You're evaluating the board, but you're also doing it within the context of your deck.
Right. And if you have a deck that leans strongly in one way or the other, it gives you a lot of clues. In general, control decks don't want to use their removal on creatures like, again, 2/3s in order to get damage through, because that damage has a very low value.
Yes.
So when you're deciding what you want to accomplish, you have to put values on, well, how much is it worth to deal damage? And most decks, it's decent to deal damage. It's not their primary focus, but is definitely on the table, whereas control decks don't really care, and aggro decks care a lot.
So, one of the things you have here is decide what you want to accomplish this turn, right? What are some of the things that you would say you often decide? Is it like develop my board, getting a bunch of damage? Like what are some of the answers that you would have for that?
Some of it is like, can I kill my opponent this turn? I mean, those are things you have to answer. I remember in one of the what's the plays I laid out, you did have an on the board win if you did it correctly, and one of the people's response was, it would have been easier to if you told us there was an on the board. Get out. I'm like, well, in normal games of Magic, you don't get a little blinker that says you've got an on the board kill. So these are things you want to notice. You want to figure out how you can advance your board position, how you can use your cards the most effectively. It's not like I start a turn and hey, I've got stated goals exactly, but it's like what are ways this turn can go well, and do I have good attacks? Do I have a good play this turn? So one step for this is you rule out obviously bad plays. Like you don't attack a 2/2 into a 3/3. Sometimes you'll bluff, but I'm just saying, imagine you're playing against someone who's going to call your bluff, for example. Don't raise 3 points of damage versus 6. If you've got a 3/3 and your opponent has 3 2/2s, you don't really want to attack, first of all because they can double block, but second of all because they can just attack you back for 6. So
that's a huge point though, Luis.
Right.
It's amazing how long it took me to grasp that. I remember watching somebody play and being like, well, you had an attack there. And they told me, yeah, but then I attack for 2, but I take 3. And I was like, oh, well, that's math, right? And sometimes those numbers get even more out of whack, where the person can just take the damage, but then hit you back for a bunch more. And once you start seeing that over and over again, is, well, how much damage does this attack cost me versus how much does it get for me? That's just a nice little tool that you can implement all the time. There's going to be times where you will actually, okay, fine, I'll take 4, but I get to hit you for 2, and I've got a game plan that helps me, finish you off sooner than I think you can, or I'm planning on gaining a bunch of life or whatever it is. But that's, that small point right there is one thing that comes up basically every single game of Limited ever, which is, if I'm going to attack you, how much am I going to take back? You should be running that number every single time you decide if you're going to attack or not.
Right. And harping back on control decks versus aggro decks, control decks don't want to race sometimes even 3 or 4 damage versus 2 damage. That's just not how you're winning the game.
Right.
So, in ruling out obviously bad plays, this is something that sounds imposing because when you start a turn of Magic, it feels like there's so many plays, there's so many possibilities. I have to tell you, the longer you play, the more you practice, the less possibilities every turn has, because you just automatically ignore a ton of the ones that you're not going to do.
Yeah.
And, there's no easy way to say, these are all horrible, don't do them. You're going to get that eventually, but part of it is don't do mismatching, things like, again, 3 points of damage versus 6. Don't offer to trade your 4/2 for their 2/1. That's just that's not a good trade. It shouldn't even be on the table. And these are, don't use, Sarkhan's Rage, deal 5 damage to their 2/2 so you can attack with your 2/2. That's just not a play that is generally going to work. And the dangerous part with all this is there's always exceptions, and I understand this, but we have to try to give you the best general guideline we can so you can put it into practice and then learn when to break these rules. So
exactly.
I think that's
fundamentals first. Yeah,
I think that's the best way to approach this, because this is trying to, step by step break down exactly what you do. So a big question you have to answer as well. You rule out some of the bad plays, and it is looking at how are you attacking this turn? How does your hand affect combat? And often your hand is not going to affect combat. You've got some creatures in play, and you've got more creatures in your hand. You don't have a combat trick. You don't have a removal spell. You still should attack before you cast your spells, because leaving your mana untapped does a couple different things. First of all, lets you bluff more tricks, lets you bluff, unmorphing if that's a thing. Your opponent has less information about what you could play during combat. Also, they have less information about what you can play post-combat. You don't want to attack with your 3/3 and let's say you have a 3/3 in play and a 4/3 in your hand. You're not going to play the 4/3 then attack, and your opponent now just has to decide whether they want to trade for this or maybe wait and trade for the 4/3. Or they have a removal spell in their hand. They have a lightning bolt that now they just take the 3 and lightning bolt your 4/3.
Right.
One of the things you often see players do is take damage from a creature then kill it in a turn. And that seems inefficient, but that happens when they've got a removal spell. They don't know if they want to use it on this creature. Nothing better comes along and they use it. Don't play the better thing that comes along before you attack. So, pretty basic, but spells before combat, generally not what you want to do. If you do have things that can affect combat, then you have to decide, kind of how that is going to work on attacks. So I'm going to talk about attacks and blocks a little bit later, but let's just skip past that part and say that it's now post combat. You've decided not to attack, or you've attacked with their flyer and they took it because that was all they could do. So when you're looking at what plays you can make, one of the best and most powerful shortcuts you can use is what's the most mana efficient play. It sounds like this rule's too general to be useful, but honestly, it's very, very useful.
It's super useful.
I actually default to this all the time, not because I just don't think about it, but because it's actually just correct so often. And that's when you have 4 mana, play your 4 mana spell, not your 3 mana spell. There are a lot of reasons for this. The most basic is 4 mana spells are better than 3 mana spells. So yes. Generally you're better off doing that. The second is it sets up your next turns better. Imagine if you've got a 4-drop, a 3-drop, and a 2-drop. Clearly you want to play the 4 on turn 4, then turn 5 you can play the 3 plus the 2. This isn't groundbreaking, but if you're ever stuck, play the most expensive spell. It honestly is that simple. It really does help to try to structure your turns this way. The other thing you have to think about is what you're going to do in future turns, and mana efficiency really helps there.
I have to say, by the way, this was my biggest level up moment for Limited ever.
Yeah, it is actually incredible how much it helps. It really does. It helps so much that my intuition so strongly tells me to play the most expensive spell that I have to always reevaluate what's the actual best spell. Because another example, if your hand is 3 3-drops and a 4-drop, it doesn't actually help you that much to play the 4 because you can just play it next turn. Either way, you're only playing 1 spell next turn. If This is turn 4. So you can play the 3-drop if it's a little bit better. If let's say that your 3-drop has reach and can block a flyer, it saves you 2 extra damage to play the 3-drop. So just play the 3-drop. That's fine there. But when in doubt, default to the more expensive spell, and often it helps you plan out your next couple turns because one of the most powerful things you can do in Magic is play 2 spells in the same turn when your opponent's only playing 1. And it really feels good to line up, playing a 4-on-4, a 5-on-5, and 2 3s-on-6. That sort of thing is very powerful.
It is, yeah. That's the number one thing that I tell intermediate people, intermediate players when they ask me, what can I do? And I'm just use up all of your mana every single turn, and your game's just opens up. You just have more stuff than your opponent does. It's that simple. This, of course, relates back to other concepts we like to talk about on the show about having a good mana curve, drafting a deck that affects the board and all these other things. But yeah, I think that's one of the big takeaways from this whole thing is, if you've got all things being equal, look for the most mana efficient play.
Right. So on your turn, you've decided what to play. Again, I'm going to talk later about how you can kind of prioritize removal spells because that's another frequent topic and the one that very much plays into this. And you've decided not to attack, so we're on, deciding which spell to play. Obviously, this is the super general case. My recommendation is generally to play the most expensive spell or the spells that can help you play the most spells over the next course of the next few turns. So then you have to kind of look at what can your opponent play? Because this is something you should be thinking about. In game 1 of Limited, it's more what cards are in the format. Post, games 2 and 3, it's often what cards have you seen out of your opponent? You have this information. One thing that a lot of players do, I actually don't, but I'm going to recommend it, is write down every card your opponent plays if it doesn't distract you. If stuff like this distracts you, I've seen people who mark down what the source of every damage is when a life total changes. I think that's way too much. I think you're actually losing equity because you're just thinking about that instead of the game. But something a lot of players do is they write down all the relevant cards their opponent plays, whether it's everything or just the combat tricks or removal spells or what have you. Like Paul Reitzel, for example, always does this. Mm-hmm. So then in games 2 or 3, he can look at his notepad there and see all the cards and just kind of decide it just helps him remember what his opponent has and what cards he should be thinking about when making his plays. again, I tend not to do this because I have a pretty good memory for cards, and I like just being in the moment and just looking at the game. So when deciding what to play around, there's another good rule of thumb here, and that is the farther ahead you are, the more you can play around. The farther behind you are, the less you can play around. And I think the best way for me to understand this, and the best way that I can explain this, is when you have a really high win percentage in the game, the base game, the game that you have in front of you where your opponent plays 0 spells, you have a really high win percentage in that game. You can afford to make that game a little bit lower win percentage and adding more win percentage to the games where they do have the spells. So an example of this is you have 3 3/3s and they have 2 4/4s and they're at 3. If you attack with everything and they have nothing, you win the game.
Right.
Often, you don't want to make this attack because if they have something, you lose your whole board, and now you probably just lose the game flat out. Problem is, if let's say you're at 2 and they have a 2/2 flyer, well, clearly you have to make the attack there, right? Your win percentage if you don't is 0.
Right.
If you're at 28 and they have no cards in hand, and you have like multiple cards, like you have multiple 5-drops and you're stuck on 4 mana, I would not attack here because you're not losing anytime soon. If your opponent, or I guess if they have 1 card in hand, sorry, because they have to have a removal spell. If they have 1 card in hand, you're not losing here anytime soon. You're actually pretty far ahead. You can afford to lower your win percentage when they have nothing, because if they have nothing, let's say right now your win percentage is 100, then you can lower your win percentage if they have nothing, because you want to add it to the games where they have one thing. Because right now, if they have nothing, you have 100% win percentage. If they have something, your win percentage is 0%. This is, of course, the extreme example, right?
Right.
Or something along those lines. You might as well just subtract because you have enough win percentage to go around. And the more cards you can play around, the better, the more different games you'll win in these different scenarios. The problem is if you take it too far, sometimes you play around cards that you couldn't actually play around, where you'd lose if they had that card anyway.
Yeah, so that's a huge mistake that people, like the intermediate players, make a lot, because they're aware that there's cards they need to play around, but they take it to such an extreme that either they play themselves into oblivion, where they end up losing, they end up giving their opponent
they just lose to the board,
find it, yeah, they just lose the game. Or, like you said, they haven't properly evaluated the board and realized that if their opponent has the card that they fear that they have, that they will just lose anyway, in which case you should ignore it.
So one of the most classic examples that people run into is playing around a sweeper. And again, this comes up a little bit more in Constructed because there's more wraths, but it's a really good illustrative example, which is people don't like getting 5 of their creatures wrathed, clearly. That sucks. It makes you feel stupid. And once people realize that they can play around wrath by not playing all their creatures, they tend to go way overboard, when often your aggro deck's not winning if the opponent has a wrath anyway. Having an extra 2/1 in your hand isn't going to do it. So they don't play extra creatures. Their opponent just has spot removal, 1-for-1 removal, and it ends up winning the game because you didn't play your extra creatures. You couldn't beat the Wrath, and so then you also now lose to the Terror. You lose to the Doomblade.
Yes.
And you want to decide, and it's hard to exactly learn where this line is, but you want to put yourself in the best position to beat the most cards your opponent can have, but you have to realize when you can't afford to do this. And sometimes you're really far behind and you have to make an attack where your opponent needs to draw 2 lands in a row and you need to draw 2 spells in a row, and then you win the game. But when your win percentage on the board is like 5% or 2%, then you have to make these like really bad looking plays because you have to get lucky to win. So yes. Playing around cards is awesome. That's one of the skills in Limited, is deciding when to play around removal spells, when to play around combat tricks, when to play around sweepers, or your opponent drawing their Atarka. And yeah, sometimes you can. Sometimes you can, maneuver the game such that you can beat all the cards your opponent has. That's great. That means your win percentage is really high in this game. Sometimes your win percentage in a game is so low that you need to assume they've got 3 lands in their hand, they're going to draw 2 lands in a row. And yeah, that's not always going to be the case. In fact, it mostly won't. But you weren't winning that game. Your win percentage in that game was really low. So you might as well grasp at straws and try to win sneak as much win percentage out of it as you can. And this is where a lot of the big edges, small edges come.
Small edges, yeah.
From the better you play. Someone like Owen Turtenwald has got just like a really high win percentage. He's like one of the highest. It's not because he has this like 9 turns ahead master plan exactly. It's more that he turns his 5%ers into 7%ers, and he turns his 82%ers into 87%ers. He gets these he takes games he's winning and plays around the cards that he can afford to play around to get his highest overall win percentage. Takes games he's losing and takes that small win percentage into a slightly larger one. Enough games fall into all these categories that you end up winning just a couple more percent of games. And, the 5% game win percentage is what separates a good player from like a world-class player and from an average player to a good player.
That's right.
Yeah. So this is one of the ways you can gain win percentage. It's play around more things, the more you're winning. Play around less things, the more you're losing. And it is very tempting to play around too much. And honestly, I play around a lot less things than people probably think because, in games you're losing, I just don't think you should. I think you should not approach games that way. So
yeah, there's also the idea of not playing around cards that you haven't seen yet, especially if they're uncommon or if they're just cards that people tend to not play that often. The example that comes to mind is if somebody could have a counter spell of some sort, right? Like not everybody likes to play counter spells in limited. They don't often, they're not always in everybody's deck or whatever. And you'll often see, again, intermediate level players where they're like, well, I want to play my spell, but they've got a couple of blue mana and maybe something else up, and I don't want to play into a counterspell, so I'm just going to say go to kind of outplay them. But if you haven't seen a counterspell from the opponent yet, it's often more correct to just run the threat out there and see what they have. Sure, if you've got a lot of reason to think that they might have it from a previous game or the way that they've played, by all means play around it. But the first time I just run my threats out. I'm just like, look, show me something, right? Like, cause your worst case scenario is not that bad there anyway, right? It's usually just a 1-for-1.
Yeah, that's a great point. You should not play around, infrequently played or high rarity cards if you haven't seen them. I think in general, you're better off assuming your opponent does not have those cards.
Yep.
And a very things Paulo said once in an article, Paulo Vitor, that's really stuck with me is, one of the reasons to pretend to sideboard, even if you're not sideboarding any cards, is now your opponent has to play around pure sideboard cards like Fog or, a Shatter or a Naturalize or a Plummet. Even if you don't have those cards, if you don't sideboard, they are pretty sure you don't have those cards in your deck. Whereas if you pretend to sideboard, you unsleeve 2 cards and sleeve 2 cards and then shuffle them in, then take them out. Your opponent now has these cards in their range of cards to play around.
That's interesting too.
So
does that bring us to attacks and blocks here?
It does. So to recap a little bit, you decided what to play based on, again, we skipped over the attacks and blocks, and we somewhat skipped over removal, which I want to talk about later, but you decided what to play based on like mana efficiency and playing around what cards your opponent has, as well as if you have the kind of deck or draw that is aggressive or controlling, that is often a good way to slant your plays as well. So, attacking and blocking. The first part is blocking is pretty easy. It sounds like a joke, but it's not. It's just the attacker has to commit first. Blockers don't have, when you're making blocks, you don't have to do them in theory. You just know what the attacks are and you know what blocks you can make.
Yeah, so, blocking's, to use a poker analogy, we call it in position in poker, where you get to act after the person that you're playing against. And it's not obvious when you first start playing poker how important that is, but ask any poker player worth their salt and they will tell you immediately that being in position is the most advantageous thing you can have at the table. And it sounds weird, but that's exactly what it is in Magic, where they have to commit to their attacks. You get to be the one to be on the defensive in a range. You get to be the one to know what you're doing. A classic example is they attack their 2/2 into your 3/3, and you get to look at your hand and figure out how you want to approach it. If you've got a removal spell, then it's real easy because you can block, and if they use a trick, you can kill it. And there's all these advantages that you get from acting last, even down to priority passes, right? Where they'll be like, declare attackers. You're like, sure. They attack with some creatures. You go to blocks. Sure. You block with some things. Now your opponent has to be the first one to act, right? If they want to pump up their creature with a spell or an ability, or if they want to use a removal spell, they have to go first. And even just being the one to act second in that scenario can be huge. So blocking is significantly easier to figure out than attacking for sure.
Definitely. And in general, when making blocks, like, the common ways to double block is you want to basically like a 4/4, you want to block with a 3/3 and a 2/2, that sort of thing. You want to add it up so that you lose the least. You have to be aware that your opponent is going to have, frequently going to have common combat tricks, especially if your opponent is making attacks that look pretty good for you. Like, again, they attack a 4/4 and a 2/3/3s. It's like a little suspicious that they would just make that trade for no reason. So you have to think, well, why is your opponent attacking in this way? And often, if you have a trick or removal in your hand, it's much easier to make these advantageous blocks. But if you don't, sometimes you get to do them. Sometimes your opponent attacks with 2 4/4s and a 2 3/3s, so they trade 1 for 1. you take 4, and the next turn they have a good attack. So there I wouldn't be much less suspicious of a combat trick. So at all times in Magic, you have to be thinking about why is your opponent doing things. You have to assume they have some kind of ulterior motive. Like your opponent often is going to have cards that make things make more sense. Like people aren't attacking 5/1s into 1/1s for no reason. And you know what? One of the reasons that you have to assume that is if they are doing it for no reason, you're probably going to win. Your opponent's just making plays at random.
Right. Yeah. I think the interesting inflection point for this, for the blocking and attacking, at least for where we've talked about it so far, is a lot of people get stuck on, like what you said. So they've got a 4/4 and they attack into your 2 3/3s. And that just doesn't make a lot of sense to you because one of your 3/3s is pretty expendable and you'd actually quite happily trade it for their 4/4. So what are they doing? And you start going through options in your head and figuring it out. Okay, that's fine. And maybe and you even narrow it down to a few of the tricks that you think that they might have because you saw one in a previous game. This is the point, though, where things can get really great about Magic because sometimes you still do it. You still say, okay, well, I figured out that you have that trick, and I'm actually just willing to let that happen here. Where I think the tendency, again, for an intermediate type player is to recognize that they could have something and then immediately decide that the best option is going to be to avoid allowing them to get value from that something or to use that something, even though there's many times where early in a game, I play a 2/2 on turn 2. My opponent has already played a 2/2 on turn 2. They untap, play a land, and attack me with their 2/2. And I think, well, they've probably got a trick here because let's say that their 2/2 is a little more valuable than mine. But I'll often block anyway because my thinking on it is...
I love blocking there.
What's that?
I love blocking there.
Yeah, and the reasoning is that if they use a combat trick to kill my 2/2 creature, that's okay, right? Like if you look at it in terms of strategic advantage, what's happened is they've spent a card to kill one of my cards, which is equal. And the really cool part that you'll see is that it'll often take up basically their turn worth of mana to be able to even make it to be able to kill your creature, and then they don't get to develop their board. And so you kind of get over these humps where I remember thinking a while ago that like I was like, oh no, I know you got a trick. I'm not going to block, right? Because I figured out in my head that this person had the trick, and it took me a while of maybe watching draft videos or figuring it out on my own to go, now wait a minute, if they have a trick, I'm not actually that bummed about it. I'll go ahead and block anyway, even though I know that they're going to use a trick to kill my creature. And I think that's the point where things get really interesting is when you figured it out, but you do it anyway, right?
Yeah, and people definitely run into the situation of like, I know you have a trick, therefore I don't want to do this. When it's mostly it's like, yeah, I just always shove the 2/2 there because you really want to trade. One of the things that came up when I was talking about a very similar, I was talking about this subject with Josh Layton and Matt Nass last week was. People don't value life high enough. A common mistake as it pertains to blocking is you attack a 2/2 no abilities into my 2/2 with some minor ability. Frequently people don't want to block because it's trade down. And then they take like 6 damage off this exchange. I would trade for a 2/2 that has come into play deal 6, or rather I would trade for a 2/2 that deals 6 damage. A 2/2 plus 6 damage is worth way more than whatever my 2/2 is worth. The value of life is actually real, and I feel like people default to not blocking too often, both because of a fear of combat tricks and because they don't want to trade down. Trading down a 2/2 for a 2/1 is something that you frequently want to do, especially because that 2/1's already hitting you for 2 right now, and then they're going to play a 3/3, and your 2/2 is not going to attack, and then the same thing's going to happen next turn, presumably?
Yes.
So you can plan out your next couple turns. Sure, if your next couple turns involve playing a 2/3, then a 3/3, and then a 4/4, maybe you don't do that because your 2/2 now has a higher value. But if your next couple plays, especially in the format of dragons or cons, where a lot of times your turn 3 play is a 2/2 that has upside, like a morph of some kind, you're not blocking their 2/1 for multiple turns, and you should just trade it off immediately because that 4 to 6 damage is worth a lot.
It's funny when John was still doing the show, John Laux, he used to call it keyword crappy.
Yes, and
it was, the creature is just like a junker that isn't very good, and so people will, instead of trading it off for their perceived better creature, they'll just take 6 or 8 damage off of some, junky card that they're just like, you shouldn't even be playing that. It's like, yeah, well, it just did 6 to you because you weren't willing to trade off your more for it. So,
yeah. So you don't want to be the person at the end of the game 6 points short because they didn't want to trade up their 2/2 vigilance for a 2/2.
Right. Exactly.
So the more complicated situation is attacking. Because when you attack, you have to, it's kind of like you're making both decisions, because before I attack, the first thing I do is think about, how's my opponent going to block? What is my opponent going to do? So you're actually figuring out both attacks and blocks, which makes attacking more than twice as difficult.
Yeah, and you'll actually see people lay out, like, they haven't actually declared attackers, but they'll put the attackers in front of the things that they assume that their opponent will block with.
Yeah, I tend not to do that because I don't like giving up information.
Yeah, I'm the same, but it's hard to process all of it. So when you're going through it, I see a lot of people do that as like a shortcut, just because it means that they don't have to process as much at once. It
is a decent shortcut if it helps you. I don't think it's a huge drawback, especially since your opponent might also be suspicious. They might think like, oh, really? You think I'm going to block your 4/4 with my 5/5 and your 3/3 with my 4/4? Then you're going to play, two creatures get +2/+2, and then I'll be dead. So
they level themselves or whatever. Yeah.
Right. So the first thing you do is think about the different permutations of blocks, and this is where it gets significantly complicated, because there's a lot of permutations on a board with, a board with 1 or 2 creatures. It's not that hard. If your opponent has a 3/3 and you have a 4/4, there's basically nothing to think about. This is one of the things that just gets immediately dismissed. If your opponent has a 3/3 and a 2/2 and you have a 4/4, well, the double block's pretty obvious. You can kind of think, do I have a trick? Am I going to attack? Once you're talking about, like, your opponent has 4 creatures and you have 4 creatures, now we've got a very high number of different combinations. And here, I think, is where reducing the mental load by playing a lot really comes into play, because I have to tell you, when I look at a board like this, I don't go through literally every single permutation, but I can just filter to the more whichever one looks like the immediate, work backwards from there until it looks too bad. Basically, like, I'll look at what the best blocks look like, and if those look really bad for me, you can often just stop at that point. You don't have to do extra work if you know you're not going to attack. If if you're like, well, I have 2 4/4s and my opponent has 4 3/3s, it's pretty easy to figure out that. But even if you mix around the numbers a bit, you can, if it clearly becomes bad for you, you can just not attack. You're not going to attack.
Right.
So once you've looked at, like, how your opponent is most likely to block, which again takes some work, and sometimes you won't have the time for all this. I have to tell you that on a complicated board, on Magic Online, you have your clock. You can use it how you will. Maybe you do have the time. I sometimes have spent 6 minutes on a play on Magic Online if it's really tough. In a live tournament, you don't have that luxury. After about a minute or two, you're going to get a slow play warning, or you're going to be told to speed up at the very least. So here's where having shorthands really helps. And again, I look top down. I try to figure out what the most appealing blocks are for my opponent, and then try to figure out why they wouldn't do those blocks. Sometimes your opponents actually play around combat tricks. It is very annoying when they do, but you are not playing against a bunch of robots that identify the best block and then stop.
Right.
You're playing against someone who's like I said before, if they saw, if you have a spell that says all your creatures get +1/+1 in first strike, they're not going to line up 5/5 on 4/4, 4/4 on 3/3, and 3/3 on 2/2. They might put their 2/2 on your 5/5 and then block 2 bigger on your other 2 creatures, because that plays around your combat trick. So don't assume your opponents are just going to immediately play around everything. It is very tough on complicated boards, and often, I hate to perpetuate doing nothing, but if the board, the more complicated the board is, the more it favors the defender, and the less likely it is that you're going to want to attack without good tricks. So when there's 6 creatures on each side, unless there's like a big mismatch between the creature sizes, or someone's at very low life total, or you have a great trick, often you're not going to want to attack in this spot. And I encourage you to try to figure out, practice going through what you would do in these situations so you can be faster about it in game. But if you can't figure it out, you can't figure it out, and you kind of have to move on. It's much better to not attack than to just attack with everything and see what happens. I can tell you how that turns out. It turns out not well for the opponent, who
very poorly.
They get to see what happens, and what happens is most of their creatures die.
Yeah, that's what usually happens. And I don't think there's any big shame in that. Everybody's on a different level. I mean, even me, who I'm in the booth, for a lot of GPs and PTs and stuff. So, part of my job is to be able to look at these board states and start to evaluate what the players are thinking about and if they're able to attack. But I have to admit, once there's 12 creatures on either side, I'm just like, I don't know. I can't just sit there and plow through all that while trying to be entertaining and thoughtful in the booth or whatever. And the usual answer is you don't have an attack here. I think that there's a direct line between how many creatures each player has on the board and how profitable an attack is. It's usually becomes less profitable the more creatures there are.
So you're going for entertaining and thoughtful mostly.
You didn't know that?
No, I didn't get that from watching. But So to break it down step by step, what I do, first thing I do is I look at my biggest or best creature. How is my opponent going to block this creature? And if they don't have a good block, sometimes I'll say, well, assuming my opponent's at like 16, I'm going to assume they're not going to block my 5/5, and then they're going to eat my smaller creatures. So you have to look, am I chump attacking by doing that? Is this attack a chump attack if they just take the biggest creature? And it's easier the lower your life total your opponent is. If they're at 5, they can't just not block your 5/5, so they have to at the very least chump block it. So then you look at, what if they put their worst creature on my 5/5, just giving up trying to fight it? How are their blocks then? And frequently, it means, like, if they have a 4/4, a 3/3, and a 2/2, and I've got a 5/5 and 2 3/3s, often that means, like, maybe they'll go ahead, or they have a 4/4, they have a 1/1 as their smallest creature. They'll just put the 1/1 in front of the 5/5 and block your other 2 creatures. Is that good for you?
Right.
Often that's not going to be good for you. So if they can't take down your biggest creature, imagine that they'll take it because they're paying some life points to get an advantage over the rest of the attack. One thing I feel like people do too aggressively is your opponent has a 3/3 and you have a 6/6 and a 2/2. Your opponent's at like 9. You're like, well, if they take the 6/6, that's great. They go down to 3, and I don't care if I throw in my 2/2. The key there is that it's not good for your opponent to chump with a 3/3. They're probably just going to take the 6 and get the 2/2 for free because they would have already taken the 6. Don't think, would I trade a 2/2 for 6 damage? Because I think that's a false dichotomy. It's not, do I want a 2/2 or do I want 6 damage? It's, do I want 6 damage or do I want to eat my opponent's 3/3? The 2/2 has nothing to do with it because you should not be attacking with it.
Yeah. And those things often, I think people often just shrug at that and say, well, I guaranteed or whatever that I was going to get my 6 damage in. But then, you often see games like that play out where that 2/2 ends up becoming important later when it's put next to another 2/2 or another couple of smaller creatures, where then you can just, go a little wider than what your opponent has. Let's say they untap and kill your 6/6.
Yeah, that's the most common result there.
Yeah. And so, you end up being able to attack for damage that you wouldn't have gotten if you didn't properly evaluate that and let your 2/2 die for no actual gain.
Right. If your opponent has nothing, then attacking with the 2/2 doesn't speed up the clock because they eat it, go to 3, and then next turn chump. If your opponent draws a removal spell, then all of a sudden it's their 3/3 versus your nothing.
Right.
And if your opponent chumped, then it's your 2/2 versus their nothing. All those scenarios are better for you if you don't attack with the 2/2. So one of the things I see on attacks in this case, or if on the reverse side on defense, is that people tend to look at how much damage they're getting through by chump attacking and overestimate that, and the mistake on the defensive there is to be chumping instead of just eating the 2/2 and taking 6. Again, this is a situation where the person with the 3/3 is in a losing position, so they can play around less cards. Yeah, you lose to a giant growth in this case, you lose to a lightning bolt, but you're not beating those cards anyway. So this is
what you were talking about earlier with picking up that little edge, right?
Right.
This is where you pick up your 5 or 7%.
And you have to assume that your top of your deck has a removal spell. Similarly, if you're at 6 and they have a 5/5 and you have a 3/3, you should almost never block there. You go down to 1 and then you hope you draw a 2/2 or a 3/3 to double block. Or you draw a removal spell and you still have a 3/3. Again, it's not huge. It's not comforting to know that you'll die to all these different things, but you're losing a game anyway. You can't assume they have these things, and you have to assume that the top of your deck is good. So I think that working from the top down has been my best result when it comes to evaluating complex boards. And
that was best case scenario for you down to worse, or at least down to a scenario where it's untenable and you stop looking.
Yes. And I start by looking at how they're going to deal with my creatures in order from best to worst. And once too many of those things become unfavorable, I stop. I kind of just don't attack. Once, of course, if you have combat tricks, this gets much, much better for you because then you can line it up and be like, wow, all these situations are great for me. Right. And especially if you have a removal spell and there's double blocks involved. So again, this is breaking it down as general as I can, which is when you're trying to do combat, just try to figure out what your opponent would do. And if it lines up for what you want, make the attack. You have to consider common combat tricks, and some of them can really swing things differently. Another thing to think about, if your opponent has a bunch of mana untapped, I default to not attacking more often. I'm not saying play around, cards you haven't seen always, but if your opponent passes with 6 cards in their hand and 5 mana, I think Enduring Victory, white and 4, destroy an attacking or blocking creature and bolster one. And I will just not attack with my creature frequently in that spot. Or if you have a 5/5 and a 2/2, and let's say they just have no creatures, I just attack with the 2/2 and see what they do. Right. Because if you pass and they don't do anything, they wasted 5 mana worth of a turn. That's huge. And you can just play another card and say go. And if they do it again next turn, then maybe I'm a little bit more likely to do it because they're not going to bluff multiple turns in a row. But often passing the first time if your opponent's leaving a ton of mana up is safer because it's so much more dangerous, especially when you're making an attack in a complicated board to attack into a bunch of open mana.
Right.
All right. So one thing to note is often you're going to have a plan, you're going to make an attack, and then something's going to change. You're going to get new information. Always reevaluate. Every time you get information, reevaluate. It sounds tedious, but this is how you get better at Magic. If your plan was to, let's say your plan was to play a 2/2 post combat, but your opponent actually traded their 3/2 for your 2/2. Maybe you play the 4/1 now because it gets in for damage. They had your opponent used a removal spell that you did not expect them to use. It actually changes your plays here. So make sure that whatever happens during a turn where you see cards or things change, just do a quick reevaluation. It doesn't mean like derive the whole situation from scratch anymore because you kind of already did that. You need to figure out what changed and how that affects your play. Often it won't be anything, but sometimes it will.
Yeah, I know of players that have forced themselves to do that basically every draw step. To approach the game as if it were a clean slate. Like, okay, where am I at here? And look around and say, okay, well, who's ahead on board? What are the life totals? Who's going to win the race or who's going to win if nothing changes? What can I do to change that? Look at the card that they've drawn. How does this change things? And it's tedious. Like you said, that isn't a good way to, go long-term in Magic, but I actually find that quite useful. And I force myself to do that sometimes if I feel like I'm, the trap that I tend to fall into is getting into a mind state about how a game's going to go and being a turn slow on realizing that is no longer the case. For example, I start out with a good aggressive beatdown start and I even get my opponent down to 10 or 8 in short order using some combat tricks and a nice curve or whatever. But now things have changed. My opponent has now started casting 5 mana spells and my beatdown plan looks a lot different than it did before. And sometimes I'll still be in the mindset of, well, how can I attack here? How can I get in for more damage? And looking at it, it's like, you can't. That's not what this game's going to be. And you need to readjust. And so if I find myself falling for that trap too often, I'll tell myself, look, just reevaluate every turn. And like you said, it's not literally from scratch. It's just that I can't tell you how many times I've watched like one of my own draft videos or walked up to one of my friends who was playing and seen the board very clearly, even though it was 7 or 8 turns into the game and things looked quite obvious to me, but they weren't to my friend because they had been playing this game the whole time and had all this other stuff in their head about where it was going and what they were trying to accomplish. And it can be really good to just reset yourself sometimes and say, all right, where are we at here? Am I beating down? Are you beating down? Do I have attacks here? What happens if this game goes long? Do I need to try to shut the door on this thing? And ask yourself those questions in your head, as you're in your upkeep or your draw step or, whatever at the beginning part of your turn. Again, not long term. I don't think that's reasonable to do every single turn of every Magic game you play, but to get that habit going and to get that muscle memory going, I think it's perfectly fine to do that for, as long as you need to do to get it there.
Yeah. In general, I just look at the delta, the difference between each turn to decide. But reevaluating the entire game state is important. And that is something you internalize, the longer you play. It is easy to get lost in these incremental changes keep happening, and now my fundamental plan is off base. But if you just look at the change every turn, you can often get a good sense of what you should be doing.
Yeah, for sure.
And so the last category I want to talk about in terms of decision-making is using removal in limited. Again, another very general topic that is difficult to break down in a way that's useful, but I'm going to give it my best shot.
Yeah, it is difficult. I think what you've got here is really good, though. But there's some fundamental things. We'll recap them at the end of this section before we move into the last section, which is, the steps you can take to help implement the things that Luis is talking about. But there's definitely some big hitters here in how to use removal and mistakes that I see all the time from newer limited players. So
the first part is have a plan. What are you trying to accomplish? How are you winning the game? And I'm gonna mention this until everyone starts having a plan, because most of the people I watch still don't. Yeah. So apologies if you've heard this. If you're one of the people who've got a plan, then that's great. My plan is to keep talking about having plans. so that just means what is your deck trying to do? How's it winning games in general? So that's like the thing that should always be in your mind when you're talking about these things. But there are some more specific things which I'm going to get into. I would say in general, the hardest decision when it comes to removal is when there's a mismatch between the quality of the removal and the quality of the target. And what that means is it's pretty easy to justify using a bad removal spell on a good creature. Most people kind of get there. They're like, wow, this is a pretty situational removal spell, and this creature's pretty awesome. I'm going to do that. Or I've got a shock, and your opponent played like, Alicia, the 3/2 first strike that, gets creatures out of the graveyard. Yeah, it's pretty easy to kind of figure out, I should probably do this. It's a little harder the other way around when it's like, I've got a lightning bolt and I should use it on a 2/1, or I've got a flatten and I should kill their 2/2. And that is really where it's hard. It's when there's a big difference between the quality of removal and the quality of the creature, it is a little harder, especially when, or basically when the removal is good and the creature is bad, it's hard to decide. When vice versa, it's a little less difficult.
And you tend to look back to what your game plan is from a deck perspective and from an in-game perspective to help, figure out what it is, how it is that you want to actually proceed from that point. Because since it's not obvious, since it is tricky, the next question is, well, how do I decide then?
So one of the best ways to decide is what is that creature doing right now and what is it going to do over the next couple turns? Going back to the example of the 2/1 that you didn't want to trade your 2/2 for. Yeah,
the keyword crappy.
Exactly. Imagine that your opponent's got a 2/1 and, again, your hand has the, equivalent of a lightning strike, 2 mana deal 3. Generally, that's not what you want to do. But if your hand, let's say you drafted a deck that I would draft, and your hand is like a divination, a 4 mana 2/2 flyer with a good ability that you don't want to trade, and a good 5-drop. It doesn't sound that bad to kill their 2/1 because the next couple turns you're not going to be able to stop it. That's a 2/1 that's going to deal 6 to you.
That's right. And, you can contrast that with a more sort of standard issue limited deck where that many of your creatures either at the bare minimum trade for the 2/1 and many of them will actually eat it. And even if you don't happen to have one in your hand, it might be worth it to save the removal spell and take a couple of, maybe 2 or 4 damage because each draw step you have could easily give you a more permanent answer to the 2/1. If you just play a 3/3, right now you've effectively nullified their 2/1, giving yourself a nice advantage there, and you've been able to keep that removal spell for later. But if you look at it and your hand doesn't provide that and your list, I mean, you built the deck yourself. If you're not the kind of deck that has some token makers or a whole bunch of 2 and 3 mana spells that can really kind of blank the 2/1, you might have to pull the trigger and kill it before it does, 6 or 8 to you.
So the other thing to look at when you're talking about any individual creature is what other spells, like you just mentioned, what other cards are in your deck, and the key is, do you have great answers to your opponent's creatures? Like, for example, what if you had a deck that had, multiple creatures that said like 3 mana 2/2 and it comes into play, deal 1 damage. Mm-hmm. You would really not want to use Lightning Strike on a 2/1 because you have multiple ways to just snap it off for free.
Yeah.
That makes you much less inclined to do that. And similarly, if your opponent has cards like Dragonlord Silumgar, Icefall Regent, or Sunscorched Regent, these like really giant unstoppable cards, and you have exactly 1 Reach of Shadows and exactly 1 Flattened that can kill like the Regents, you really have to conserve those because, yes, some games will dictate that you have to use it on a 3/3 because otherwise, you'll take too much damage. But in general, if you only have 1 or 2 answers for your opponent's cards that you can't beat otherwise, you have to have a very good reason to use them. So the value on those spells goes up.
Yeah, that's a situation you'll find yourself in fairly often too, especially given we talked about it earlier, but the mid-range nature of most limited decks is that you'll find yourself in a position where you're not really in a race. You're not really that far ahead. Your opponent's not really that far behind. So this game's probably going to go for 5 or 6 more turns, assuming that nothing crazy happens. And, if you decide to snap off your Reach of Shadows on their mediocre creature that you didn't really need to kill, but maybe it got you in a little extra damage or prevented a little bit of damage, and they play your dragon, you just haven't properly planned for the long game. You've set yourself up to basically lose to the dragon. And, that's one of those things where you have to leverage the resources that you already have on the board, in a smart way. I see people get too aggressive, right? With their removal pretty often.
Yeah, I think the most common side of the spectrum people fall onto is using the removal too easily. They don't value their removal spells high enough, and they use their good removal spells on creatures that aren't quite as good. Most decks can't push through 6 damage like super easily. You're not playing against a lot of burn, and snapping off Flattens on 2/2s is just not a way to go about things. I especially see this with people who play a lot more Constructed, actually, because in Constructed it's kind of the opposite. Decks in Constructed, all creatures are good and all removal is good, and you just basically every spell just kills a creature as soon as you can.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
It's a simplification, but that's really how it is. It's like, well, I've got 3 removal spells in my hand and 20 in my deck. They played a 2/2, kill it.
Yeah, it just dies, and that ends up being a thing. But in limited, that is certainly not the case. And if you're lucky enough to draw some of your removal spells, you have to be damn sure you can back up, killing a mediocre creature with it, with a victory of some sort. The way that I end up looking at these things a lot of the time is, I think about a threat that my opponent puts out. And let's just say it's a threat that I do need to deal with. A good example would be like an Atarka Efreet. Let's say they flipped it up, it's a 6/2, right? I obviously just can't take damage from a 6/2 repeatedly, or I'll lose the game in short order. So I can look at the different options that I have. And for me, the best way to deal with that card is to have a blocker. And basically any blocker that I'm going to put in my deck is going to trade for a 6/2. And, that way you can use your Reach of Shadows either on a bigger creature, or if your opponent decides to open the door for you, you can block with your 2/2. And when they go Temur Battle Rage or, Tread Upon or whatever, now you get the 2-for-1, and that's the blowout, right? And even if, again, I love hitting these little corners of the game, because like we talked earlier about one of those, and this is another one of them, where like if your opponent offers up the 2-for-1, do you take it? I mean, 90% of the time you probably do, right? It's really difficult to let go of, but at the same time, sometimes it means taking a bunch of damage and then just blocking with another 2/2 the next turn, and you still can't beat that dragon that you saw in game 1. It's not on the board yet, but if you go for the 2-for-1 or whatever, and they play their dragon, you could lose that game pretty easily too. So obviously there's a lot to it. But I think that one useful way to look at this is, okay, if I need to answer something, what are the answers that I can have? And a lot of the time it's creatures, it's blocking, and those end up being your removal. And that means that you don't need to reach out there and use your removal right away on the first thing that your opponent plays, or the first decent thing that your opponent plays. You can actually leverage your creatures. And, that goes back, to sort of one of the core philosophies that we talk about on the show all the time, which is that you need to affect the board, right? Like you don't want to have too many cards that don't do anything, because this is what even mediocre creatures do, is they can act as removal and put less pressure on the removal that you actually have, so that you can use it on your opponent's best stuff.
And following up with that, the way that the value of removal changes based on your deck composition. And one good rule of thumb is that the more good removal you have, the less you should save it.
That's a good rule of thumb for sure.
If you have a lot of good removal spells, then the quality that you need of creature you need to wait for just goes down, because you have more ways to kill them. Imagine a deck that had 5 Doomblades in it. Like, you're not going to be short on ways to kill 4/4 flyers, so you're actually okay to Doomblade a 2/1 flyer, if your opponent plays one on turn 3. And on the flip side, the more good creatures you have, the less you want to kill creatures you can easily beat in combat. Because the kind of creatures you really need to kill with removal are ones that combat doesn't help with. Again, Silumgar, Sunscorched Regent, going back to a set or two, like, Pelukritos is an incredible creature that you need a removal spell for.
Yes.
These are the kinds of things that you're not beating in combat. So if your deck has good creatures, then yeah, you don't need to kill their 3/3s or their 2/2 flyers, because you've got better answers to those. And this is why actually too much removal, not a problem you have often, but it does mean that just be aware there's diminishing returns on it, because the more removal you have, the worse creatures you're going to have to use it on. So sometimes a 3/3 is better than a deal 3, because you want to block, you can hold off multiple 2/2s. Of course, you can usually pick up those creatures later, so taking removal is still generally good. But when you have close decisions, again, the more removal you have, the less it's generally worth.
Yeah, so I think the big takeaway from this, though, especially if you happen to be a newer player to Limited and somebody who's still kind of figuring it out, is you should be selective with the removal. You need to be able to identify the times when it's appropriate to kill a creature that you wouldn't normally kill with the removal spell. We talked about that with the example of the 2/1 when you're not doing much else for, when you're doing other stuff for the next few turns, it does pop up. But if you want to talk in generalities, most people fire off their removal too easily. It's funny, but I think the baseline makes sense, which is that, well, I'm here to play Magic, and you played something and I can kill that something. So I'm going to kill that something, right? It's sort of this very base level thinking of like playing a game, right? Like there's not that many games that people play regularly, outside of like gamer games like we're into, but like your normal people games or whatever, where you're rewarded for not doing something, right? It's just like, well, I'm going to roll the dice. I'm going to spend my money. I'm going to build a hotel, and like you do stuff. That's what you didn't drive all the way to the shop to not do stuff. Right. And so, it can really get you over the hump if you start to realize, well, I can actually afford to be quite selective with these things, and I'm actually rewarded for it quite greatly too.
Exactly. And going back to the more general things is don't kill things your creatures can kill. Yep. Put a value on life, but probably put a lower value on life than most people do, because people tend to be a little too hasty. And the more information you have about your opponent's deck, the better decisions you can make. That's just going to be true overall. But if I haven't seen a card like these cards that I've named, these Regents and Silumgars, by game 3, then I'm going to be a little more lax and use Reach of Shadows on random 4/5s, because I haven't seen a better target. And especially the other thing you have to realize is if it's game 3 and you've seen a couple rares, but aren't the rares that fall into this category, then you can be more confident. If you haven't seen a single rare out of your opponent, well, they probably have one lurking in their deck somewhere they just haven't drawn.
Yeah, that's right. And it does also speak to the modern era for Limited, where we have seen certain sets come out that have very, very powerful rares, maybe somebody with a little more hyperbole than I would say, unbeatable rares, right? And, while that isn't technically the case, these are rares that warp the game in such a huge way that if they're not answered, they usually do lead to a victory pretty shortly after. And, you do have to respect those as well. Looking at the, Fate Reforged and sets like that, where, the rares seem to have spiked up a bit even more. And if you're a little too hasty with your removal, you can easily find yourself without an answer to that rare and not much time to find one.
Exactly.
Okay. So, what are the big steps for people? We're talking, of course, about how to make in-game decisions, right? And you've laid out, and we've talked for, about an hour about this now. It's a lot of stuff to take in. So as far as actionable things that people can do, they're going to absorb the information that we've given them. We've given them some tips about, some big hitting tips about, all things being equal, be mana efficient if possible, sequence your play so that you can use your mana the best. Don't be hasty with your removal. Make sure that you're actively thinking about, do I need to use this or not? But what are some of the ways that our listeners can, help improve their decision-making process?
By far the best way to improve this, I believe, is practice. And I think that the more you play, the more you pick up, especially if you're actively learning. Don't just play on autopilot. Like I've seen, especially on Magic Online, it's very easy to do this. In real life too, where you're just kind of playing. You're just clicking. You're just making plays. You're not really thinking about what you're doing. You're not learning when you do that. You're just playing Magic, which is fine. Playing Magic is fun. Play Magic however you want. If you really want to develop your skills while playing Magic, you have to be an active participant. And it's easy to not be an active participant even if you're moving cards around. So make sure you're getting something out of games you play. I think a lot of this practice and a lot of the things you can do to get better, honestly, it's making it so that you have to do less work later, because a lot of the things you have to consider start to fade away the more you play, because you can just automatically dismiss a lot of them and you don't have to waste a lot of brain space or time thinking about them, which gives you more time to think about the things that are really difficult, which is, figuring out how to attack when your opponent has 4 creatures in play. So practice, I would say, is by far number 1, but there's a lot you can do that isn't practice. Watching good players play. I think we have unfettered access now to watching good players play, between streams where people are talking about what they're doing, videos where people are going through, their thought processes during a video, and then coverage where you have commentators talking about what the players are doing and you're just observing the players too. Why are the players doing these things? You can, of course, listen to their commentary, listen to what they're saying, but you can also just watch them. Even watching without listening to anything is useful, because if you're watching and thinking, why are they doing that at all times, then you can get a better sense. I can't overstate how many resources are at your disposal compared to 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, or 15 years ago. There's just so much information that you have, and prioritizing watching people who are really, really good, I think is a big part of it. And if you only have limited time to spare, I certainly like doing stuff like watching the World Championships is huge, or watching Pro Tours. Those are the ones I would definitely focus on, because you will see people who are the best of the best playing, and you can get a very good sense of what they're doing.
Yeah. Another one that pops up, and this is a huge one, I think, for if you talk to anybody on the Pro Tour, this is something that happens constantly. It just never stops, which is discussing your games, right? Discussing your matches. Talk to the players that you think are better than you, or at least your peers. And, not everybody has this available, right? Sometimes you're kind of the king or queen of your shop, or, you just don't really have somebody to access that. But I think that most of the time you can find somebody who you think is better than you at the game and get a chance to ask them. And that's just, it's an endless resource, right? Talking about plays, working through, just being open to asking somebody who you think's better than you. Well, why did you do this? I was standing behind you at the PTQ. I saw you make this play. Why did you do this? And, they'll walk you through their decision. Now, that doesn't mean that, you take what everybody else says as the gospel, but it's more information, and it certainly should be able to help you, work through your own processes and maybe add some tools to your toolbox too.
Definitely. And, again, discussion, even if you don't end up agreeing with what the person is saying, discussing why you don't agree is very good too. Yeah. Thinking about why they would do things differently.
By the way, anybody that knows any professional players personally knows that this is a big part of the deal too.
The disagreements?
The disagreements. Yeah. It's everybody has their own opinion on stuff. But I think that there is a lot of value to working through those, even if it ends up being an argument, or even if the people don't agree in the end. Like, at least for me, just getting a chance to hear the thought processes. I don't really care that much about any one specific play, but I like to hear, I'll often ask people questions, that I think I already know the answer to, but I just want to hear how they think through it. And I think that there's a lot to be gained by just, listening, right? Just like listening to other people and what they say. Again, it's not that you have to take it, as fact. It's just that you get another perspective on it, and that's invaluable.
Definitely. And going into that, it's post-game analysis. Even in games you win, this is the important part. It's very easy when you lose a game to think, oh man, what could I have done differently? What are these different decision trees? Where was a fork in the road, or what choices could I have done differently? But when you win games, you should do that too. You're cutting off, like let's say you win half your games, right? Just for simplification. If you only analyze the games you lose, you're losing out on a lot of games where you could improve, because it's not like winning a game means you played perfectly. In fact, often you'll win games where you play very badly. Yes. I can attest to that. and thinking about what you could have done differently, even when the end result was positive, is very important, because that gives you the full amount of benefits. And yeah, it's hard to. You're not going to do it every single game. I understand that. But the more games you can look at and think about, even if it's just by yourself, thinking about what could I have done differently, how would that have changed things, that's useful. Just introspection is very, very good.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, if you want to take it to the next level, I don't think this is for everybody, but if you do, there's a lot of either cheap or free screen capture software for those of you who play Magic Online, and you can record yourself playing. And I know it sounds a little silly because you're like, but I played it. I know what I was doing while I was playing. But I'll tell you, I started doing draft videos a few years ago, and I still do them now. And it is so weird to watch yourself play, because you're just like, you make mistakes that you're just like, I didn't think I'd ever make that mistake. I know what that card does, and I did it anyway. And sometimes you don't even realize it. Like I've, had people point out countless times, like, oh, you could have, gotten a little bit of value here. Like if you sack this first, then that thing goes on the stack, and then it's, oh yeah, I just did it wrong. I wasn't really thinking about it or whatever, all the way up to you actually had lethal this turn and you just missed it. And now that thankfully for me doesn't happen super often, but it used to. And, I remember when I first started playing Magic, one thing I did was this, and I know it sounds a little extreme, but I did. I recorded myself playing, and I sat down with Ryan, before we started the podcast, and my friend Jay, who's pretty good at Magic. And I just said, can you guys watch my games with me and go over them and let me know, what I'm doing, if I'm missing anything. And I learned a lot from that. And I was still in the basics at that point. I remember one of the big lessons I learned was to always make sure that you're looking for the path to victory, because I think I was very much in the mindset of just playing my cards and kind of seeing what happened. But, my friend Jay really was always on the thing of, well, how are we winning this game? Like if I do this, this, and this, do we win the game? Is this, and this? And, it made me start to look at the game under a different lens of like, I'm trying to get from point A to point B, as opposed to just playing out the cards and see what happens. And you can't really do that, I don't think, unless you're willing to be, open and just say, look, I'm I'm going to watch myself play. I'm going to show it to somebody else, and it's going to be embarrassing. I mean, you will see stupid stuff that you're just like, I cannot believe I made that mistake. I just missed it. Or I got into this crazy line of thinking and I was unable to get myself out of it. But I will tell you that, becoming aware of those leaks is the first thing to do if you want to fix them. And this certainly does that. Another one that we've mentioned on the show before is raredraft.com. It's just a site that you can upload your drafts from Magic Online and people can watch them after the fact. It only takes a few seconds to do it. And, again, that's just a really nice tool for just saying, would you have drafted this differently? Do you think I made any big mistakes? What am I doing wrong in this format? And if you want to take the time to show that to some people that you respect, it's a great way to do it too.
What if you don't like rare drafting?
Who doesn't like rare drafting?
Well, so another thing going in this vein is, don't just blame luck when you lose. I mean, yeah, it's convenient. It's also, it feels better. I certainly do it all the time because I know that I legitimately am very unlucky.
Yeah, sure.
But if you just blame luck when you lose, you're deferring responsibility, and you're just not going to get better. So don't overuse that. One of the best things, like you said, about looking at a video and seeing where you screwed up, that's awesome. That means you have a thing you can improve on, which will improve your win percentage. If you truly believe you only get unlucky to lose, well, you've got nowhere to go. How are you going to get better? You're not going to get luckier. I mean, you can't just find a 4-leaf clover. So I guess
I'm sure you've tried.
Right. But, if you find mistakes, those are actionable things. Those are things you can improve on. And that ultimately is the quest for perfection is really what drives a lot of people playing Magic, myself included. And, the game is obviously very fun, but the game of trying to not make mistakes is pretty fun too. At least I think so.
Yeah. And I think that, our listener base certainly agrees. One other tool that you can use, and again, this is putting in some work, but if you want, when a set comes out, and you've got it all, it's all out. You can go on a site like magiccards.info, is the one I usually use to look up Magic cards, and you can do a filter where you can look at all of the instant speed things that cost, say, less than, 4 or less or whatever from a format, and you can make a list of those quite easily from each color. You can strike out the ones that you wouldn't deem playable or a card that you would expect to see played very often. And that's going to be your list of things that you need to play around or consider when you're doing this whole combat thing that Luis was talking about earlier. Now, I don't know that I would do this for every set. I certainly don't, because it just starts to become second nature that you start to remember these things. But, I talked earlier about poker and how I had to go home and look up things on the computer and then start to develop these sort of patterns in my head and until I could do it at the table where I could, it became part of my muscle memory when I was playing. But that didn't just happen to me sitting at the table. I had to do some work off of the table. And I think that this is one way that you can do this here as well, is oftentimes people get the idea that they're scared of something. They might not know what it is, but the question is the phrase you could hear is, well, they could have something. And it's like, that is true. And it's good that you're aware that your opponent could have something, but let's get nitty gritty. What could they actually have? Right? And if you take the time to make this list ahead of time, you can print it out or just have it up or even just memorize it. It's not as big as you think. Each color doesn't get 7 premium removal spells or whatever that are instant speed. Remember, the sorcery ones don't really matter in this context. It's the instant speed ones. And again, you can go up to 5 mana or whatever, but it's usually the 1, 2, and 3 mana ones. Maybe you go up to 4 that you need to know. And you'll find that the list is actually a lot shorter, and you can actually just tackle this as a problem that you can work through. And if you do it enough times, your brain will start doing it anyway. You'll start remembering the combat tricks and the stuff like that when it comes out. And you'll be able to sort of make that part of your muscle memory. And again, it takes some work. I mean, I'm not saying that this is a particularly fun exercise to do, but I found that when I've made people do this, people were like, hey, I want to get better. How can I do this? And I said, go make this list. They've all been surprised at how much shorter the list was than they thought.
Yep.
All right. Well, that's going to do it. Good stuff, Luis. It was pretty cool to get a view into your brain when it comes to how you break these things down. And I think that people that are fans of watching you play will be amazed how quickly you can do this now and how, in the back of your head it is. It's pretty insane to watch when we watch you play under the lights, at the Pro Tour and stuff.
Yeah. And I do have to say that a lot of it is work that has gone, in over time. Like, a lot of it is that you end up figuring out a lot of the plays. Like, when I say something like, well, you dismiss the plays that aren't good. And I understand that that's very much simplifying it, but a lot of the practice, a lot of the work we're putting in, a lot of the lessons we're trying to get you to internalize are so that you don't have to worry about, figuring out why it's bad to attack a 3/3 into 2/2/2s if you don't have a trick.
Yes. But once you figure that out, you can file that away, and then there just becomes a list. And it turns out there's not as many combinations as it seems like there are when you first start. There's a lot. I mean, Magic's the best game, but it's also one of the hardest games to get good at for good reason. But yeah, I think that's one of those things that comes to you over time for sure. All right, well, that's going to do it for the show this week. If you want to find us on social media, I am Marshall_LR on Twitter, and Luis is LSV. The show, as always, is brought to you each and every week by channelfireball.com. Make sure you check out their website for a full selection of singles, as well as sealed product and even supplies. And if you're planning on going over to Copenhagen for the GP, gpcopenhagen.com is where you can find information for that. If you, and of course, by you, on the Patreon, we certainly appreciate your support there as well. If you want to send us something a little bit longer, you can do so via email, lr@lrcast.com. I've fallen woefully behind on answering the emails, but I usually sit down for 4 or 5 hours and get all caught up, and I will be doing that, I'm sure, in the near future as well. But that's going to do it for this week. We appreciate you taking the time to hang out with us. We love talking Limited. We love talking Magic, and we love that you joined us for it, and we'll see you next week. So today I want to talk about a way that I believe you can greatly improve your dining experiences. Of course, I'm talking about the credit card game. And this is a ritual that is not confined to Magic. It is, certainly has happened, or maybe even originated in poker. I don't know. It did, yeah. It was called credit card roulette when it was first.
Right, because I know that Ifro and some of the other poker players, Dave Williams, for example, are among the big proponents in Magic. But now it's just completely all over Magic. And let me explain the basics real quick. There's some. So the basic is, let's say you and 3 other friends go out to dinner. At the end of the dinner, the bill comes. That's usually what happens. Instead of each of you figuring out, you each put in a credit card. The credit cards get shuffled, and you randomly determine who's going to pay for the entire meal. So I have to say, the first time I heard about this, and the first time most people hear about this, you're like, wow, that sounds insane. You could end up paying, $40 for a $10 meal.
Right. But
I want to actually defend the credit card game and actually try to convince you to do it, because I don't think it's nearly as degenerate as people seem to think it is. So, and I believe I actually have an actual basis for this argument, unlike most arguments I make.
Well, that's good to know.
So here's my main argument for it, and this comes into context, especially if you go to meals with like the same group of people, like the same group of friends a lot. It doesn't have to be exactly the same. It's when you go out with, again, you and 3 other friends, so 4 people, the pain of paying for your lunch, your entire lunch, 4 people's lunch, is not 4 times as bad as paying for 1 lunch. I think that's actually true. Like, so social studies actually have, some, I mean, again, this is social science, so there's some amount of ambiguity, but it's not like, it's painful to pay for your own lunch, right? There's, obviously it's, you're giving someone else money. That pain is not magnified 4 times. It's not 4 times as bad when you pay for everyone. But the joy what you get out of a free lunch is very high.
Oh, it's very high.
And this varies individual to individual. I know people who refuse to game, and I think that's the right decision for them. But like, if I were to quantify it, paying for everyone's lunch is, let's say, twice as bad as paying for my own lunch, so not 4 times. And getting a lunch for free, I believe, is worth more than I would have paid for that lunch. So let's say I get 1.5 times the value every time I get my lunch for free, and it's 2 times the value when I pay for everyone else. If I lose every 4th time, because again, it is random, and I'm assuming everyone's meal is about the same value, but I'll get into that. Then I'm getting a higher total value if I go, plus 1.5, plus 1.5, plus 1.5, minus 2, right. Then minus 1, minus 1, minus 1, minus 1. Right. And again, numbers are just completely made up, but I truly believe that my happiness level has gone up immensely by doing this. Because when I game and I lose, I bought my friend's lunch. That's not the end of the world. But when I get a free lunch, getting a free lunch is just incredible. You don't have to take out your wallet. You don't have to pay for anything.
I mean, they say there's no such thing as a free lunch, but it turns out there is if you game.
Right. And in the long term, you should be even. Again, if everything's, roughly even, if someone is ordering 3 times as much as everyone else, there are things you can do about that, clearly. But in general, for the example, I'm using a roughly even number. Also, I believe that the equity of not having to figure out your bill and, everyone's trying to figure out how much they owe and you always end up $6 short, all that, you save all that time and your friend got to buy you lunch. That's awesome for you.
Yeah, it is. This comes up all the time, that practical side of it, right? Yeah. Where you just don't have to go through all the hassle. I
think there's 2 practical sides. One is there's less hassle. I think that's just absolutely true. So it's just more efficient than trying to split a bill, especially when you have like 10 people. Yeah,
from a time perspective, you're at the restaurant for 15 minutes longer if you've got a big group.
The second is, again, I do believe your net happiness goes up if that sort of equation makes sense to you. Again, for some people like Paulo, for example, him getting a free lunch is not that much better than paying for a lunch, but paying for everyone's lunch is way worse for him. So that he doesn't like gaming as much. And I completely understand that. I'm not saying you shouldn't game. Or you should game if that's the case. But I think for most people, I think the way it plays out, I believe that your net happiness does go up by doing this. I do have to say that if you can't handle the variance, like if sometimes you just can't afford to pay 4x a lunch, or if you're gaming with like 6 people, 6x a lunch, then don't game. No one should ever feel like they're forced into it. We definitely don't try to make people game. I think that's just bad manners.
Yeah, it's bad.
But, my favorite games are honestly when everyone's having like around a $10 lunch. You're just going somewhere cheap for lunch, like with coworkers. We always game now because it's faster, it's easier, and your happiness goes up. I don't know if I've said that yet.
I literally gamed for my lunch today.
Yeah, it's just incredible. And for advanced players of the game, we also have the next level game. So let's say you're again with those same 4 people. One of the people decides they don't want to game. That's fine. That's their choice. They just put in $10. It used to be that you'd game, and then the person who lost got the $10, then paid for lunch. So they ended up paying $30 instead of $40 because there's only 3 people in the game, right? In the next level game, the second to last person, because the way we generally do it is one person holds all 4 credit cards, and you eliminate them one by one. The last person standing pays. In the level game, you eliminate the first 2, and then you eliminate the third, and the last person pays for the entire bill, and the person who went out third, the second to last person, gets the $10.
Yeah.
And that's the next level game. And that I can't justify with anything, but it's just fun to gamble.
Yeah.
There's no efficiency there. There's no net happiness nonsense. It's just fun to gamble.
Yeah. And one of my best stories involves a very large next level game that I have to ask Rashad if I'm allowed to tell on the podcast before I do. But sometimes it gets a little out of hand.
I'm actually just going to tell it because I was there. Rashad once put his credit card in to game for the bill when he literally ordered a soda and nothing else because he'd already had dinner.
Yeah, that's true too. Yeah, this is a different one.
Well, this is the one I was sitting right next to him for. The bill comes, it's like $300 because there's a lot of people. There's 15 people there. This is and just like some random diner. Rashad games. We're like, Rashad, why are you gaming? Your bill's $2. Just pay your bill. He's like, well, I could win the next level game, and then he does. So Rashad walked away with $40 when he had a horrendous equity in the game. Everyone's dinner was $20. His is $2. He should not put a card in.
All right, well, my story ends a little bit differently for Rashad.
Oh well, I'll let you get permission for him because I actually don't know that story either. Yeah. And then the last thing is, if people order vastly disparate amounts, you can also do the straight up equity game, which is a little more complicated. Here, again, we're going back to the same example. Let's say everyone ordered $10 worth of food except one person ordered 20. One way to make it fair is you do the equity game, which is you generate a random number between 0 and the total of the bill, and then you count up starting from the top, and whoever's item that number lands on has to pay.
Oh, that's brutal.
So imagine that
just make them put in 2 cards.
You can do that, but equity game is the easiest when you don't know exactly what the ratios are. And some people ordered $37, some people ordered $17, some people ordered $19, and whatnot.
Pretty cool. I've never done that.
Because your percentage of the bill is exactly equal to how much your percentage to lose is exactly equal to your percentage of the bill. It's exactly fair. It's a little less fun because you're just doing a bunch of math, but that is one way to make it easier if you do want to do it. So this is how the vast majority of meals get settled at Magic tournaments. I will tell you that. And, I advise trying it if you have some, especially meals on the cheaper side. I find that the efficiency just is almost already justifies it. And again, I think getting free lunches is sweet. Plus, if you're lucky, sometimes you just don't pay for lunch for weeks and then you just feel awesome. So This is our dinner ritual.
I briefly consider a career in the game. I've ran that good.
Well, there we go. So some people are luckier than others. I find it mostly a good way to treat my friends and teammates to dinner every single time we have dinner. Yeah. And, that if that's my role, that's my role. So next time that you have a good opportunity, I would suggest trying it. If it's not for you, it's not for you. But honestly, it's a way to spice up what's normally not the least fun part of the meal.